Thank you, Adam. And Adam, can you just confirm that you can hear me okay and see me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Fabulous. I'm Jack Kirby. As Adam said, I'm Associate Director of Collection Services for the Science Museum Group. I am a bald, middle-aged white man in a blue shirt with a flowery pattern on it. I'm wearing glasses and hearing aids, which are probably obscured by the headset that I'm wearing. I will share my screen so that you don't have to look at me for much longer. Bear with me a moment. And hopefully you will now have the slides. So in this talk, I'm going to cover some things that we've done, but just a bit about me first. So I kind of have worked through my way through larger organisations through my career. So I started off very small at the Ragged School Museum in East London, a small independent. I worked for a local authority museum for a year in Greenwich. I worked in Birmingham for several years at think tank, the Birmingham Science Museum, which is now part of Birmingham Museums Trust. And then in 2012, I joined the Science Museum Group based here in Manchester, initially as head of collections for our museum, the Science and Industry Museum here in Manchester, but then subsequently since 2015 as first group head of collection services and now associate director of collection services. And I guess on this journey, I found actually the needs of large and small organizations are not that dissimilar, really. It's just about scale and budgets. So I think whatever the scale, whatever your budget, there will be hopefully things that are transferable from this talk, and whatever kind of your organization you're in, whatever kind of heritage or other culture that you deal with. And so this is, I guess I don't inherently think of myself as a digital leader, but if you look at my career, effectively I have been. So I'm going to talk about just one of our projects, but I could have talked about a whole range of different things. If I just say a tiny bit more about my approach, I think it's overall, I look for ways to innovate and have impact. And I think about what skills do I already have in the organization, as well as what new skills might I need to bring in from outside. And I guess I've spent time exploring and understanding just enough to ask the right questions and understand the answers. And so I wouldn't claim to be a digital expert, but I kind of know enough to know who to ask and what to ask them. And maybe that's all you actually do need. In terms of what I'm going to talk about, just a brief introduction to the Science Museum Group. So we are an English National Museum group, but we do work closely with our counterparts in the other nations as well. And we have 5 museums. I'm here in the middle in Manchester. We've also got museums in York, County Durham, Bradford, Science Museum in London, and then the National Collection Centre in Wiltshire. And we have around 5 million visitors a year in typical years before the pandemic to our museums, but even more increasingly online, which is important as well. I was appointed to my current role, and the digital director, John Stack, who I work quite closely with, was appointed to his role at the same time in 2015. And each of us produced a strategy which we took to our Board of Trustees in December that year. And I just want to draw out the points that I've highlighted in red here. I'm not going to bore you with all of our strategies, which were quite organisation specific, but the transferable bits are useful. So in terms of digital strategy, we knew that digital wasn't something that sat in a department or a team. It needed to be an organization-wide endeavor. We had our heritage, our collection, up front in what we wanted to achieve with digital. So providing access, but recognizing that that front end of access needs a back end as well. It needed investment in infrastructure, as well as things like our user interface. And we were also very keen on open access and making sure that what we were doing would be as open as possible. And so that was foundational to what we were trying to achieve as well. And the technical infrastructure underlying all of that is where we've made quite a bit of investment, but driven by projects that we were doing. So we didn't go out and say, we want to invest in the digital infrastructure. We said, we're going to do this thing and we need digital investment to help us achieve it. And then on my side, the collection services strategy, we had, as I'll demonstrate in the talk, I hope, quite an old-fashioned approach to how we were doing things. It was still very paper-based. And so part of my strategy was just about let's use technology better, and we can, there are other benefits as well as efficiency that come from that. It can help us to improve our accountability for the national collection. And let's also not try and do it all at once. So the project I'm talking about today, we're only now, having delivered it a few years later, starting to roll out some of it into our business as usual processes, because changing everything at once would have been too disruptive. But having those strategies in place was also important, because it meant that subsequently later, when we did come to ask for investment, we were able to point back and say, well, the board signed this off, and therefore it's the investment that we're asking for absolutely fits with what we said strategically we were going to try and achieve. So on to the project that I want to tell you about. And this project was a challenge that became an opportunity. It was interesting when Adam said digital transformation can be scary. My reaction to that is, well, it can be exciting too. And actually, if you try and think of the positives rather than the challenges, then you can build a vision that people will buy into. And so our challenge was Blythe House, which you see here in the central photograph. This is a building in West Kensington in London, which houses around, or did house until very recently, around 280,000 of the Science Museum Group's objects. And it's also shared with the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum. And in 2015, the government announced that they were going to sell this building, and in our case, we would need to move everything to the National Collection Centre, to a new building, which is just outside Swindon. And the challenge was that we didn't have a complete idea of what we had in our collection. So we knew that at least a third of the objects in this building weren't on our digital catalogue, our existing catalogue. We knew that we didn't have great data about where all of them were. They are full of hazards. You can see on the right-hand side, we have lots of very exciting hazards in the Science Museum Group collection: radiation, asbestos, mercury, all the kind of things that you don't want in your home. And only about 5% of them were photographed and online with an image. So I saw this as a massive opportunity to sort this out. If we're going to have to move everything anyway, let's look at how we can do that in the most efficient way possible and make some improvements along the way. And I started out by looking at how our teams were working on the ground. And this slide here is probably the most important one, because what I went in there with was a fundamentally curious approach. These questions you could apply to any organisation, not just even heritage organisations. So I spent time with the teams who were on the floor doing work and talking about how they worked. And I found that things hadn't really moved on very much since I'd entered the sector around the millennium. We were still doing quite repetitive tasks very manually, walking around stores with clipboards, writing things down on the clipboard, going to a room that had a static PC in it, entering data, probably getting some of it wrong in doing that double entry in effect. And we weren't making any use of portable technology, and our staff's skilled time was instead being spent sort of re-entering data that they'd already captured manually in the store. And this didn't seem like the most profitable way forward, given that by 2015, pretty much everybody had a smartphone. And I thought, my people are using handheld technology in every aspect of their lives except at work. And so thinking about how we could do it differently was quite key to having the first ideas about what we subsequently did. and I then looked beyond my own organisation. I think this is always a really good thing to do. Who is doing interesting work in the museums, libraries, archives, kind of sectors, heritage sector, but equally who's doing interesting things in other sectors. So find the interesting people, talk to them about what they are doing, and look for things that we could emulate, and equally beyond the museum and heritage sort of sectors, what is the commercial industry doing and what could we learn from that? So it might seem completely different, but actually when you start to look at the logistics of how we all received parcel deliveries during the pandemic, there's lots of similarities. You need to know what you've got. You need to know where it is. You're going to need to package it up and send it off somewhere. And if you look at how those kind of industries work, that was where we started to get the idea of using barcodes with our database, because actually every package you get from Amazon or whoever comes with at least one and probably multiple barcodes on it. So we were looking around and saying, who else out there is doing interesting things within the sector? People like libraries were doing things that were ahead of what museums were doing as well. So we were looking for those kind of precedents that we could then adapt, and an emphasis particularly for behind the scenes work on stable technology, because you don't necessarily need everything to be whizzy and innovative. You just want something that's got longevity. And we were thinking about how could what we were doing for this project also feed into our long-term work. So what we came up with then was technology-driven workflows. So effectively systematizing previously quite not very written down processes sometimes, and making them things that you could use with barcodes, with barcode scanners as seen here, that linked into our existing database. We weren't going to try and reconstruct everything from scratch. That was too big an ask. And how we could effectively speed up what the teams were doing and make their jobs therefore focused on the bits that only people could provide, the identification of objects, or the detailed condition checking that conservators need to do, for example. So we effectively invested in both the hardware, the kind of handheld and portable devices, Wi-Fi, and then some behind the scenes quite neat technical stuff to connect things up. And this resulted in a production line approach and meant that we have an accurate location for all our objects at all times, and that gets updated by scanning the barcode. And what this fundamentally meant was less time spent on each object. And so when I came to make the case for investing in this, because it wasn't cheap, it has to be said, but we needed to move everything anyway, and I was able to demonstrate that the upfront cost of all the investment that we were making, which was people as well as the technology, would result in, firstly, a more efficient process of delivery. Secondly, management benefits. So you can see here one of our dashboard reports, so that we have an accurate idea of where we're up to, which we never used to in the old days. We only knew physically that we'd cleared a particular room. We couldn't really see it in data terms, what we were doing. And then a massive public benefit as well, because we've been able to put the collection online, which we just didn't have at any scale before. And so I used a series of slides like this to sell this to our program board for the project and demonstrate that we'd gone, for example, with our inventory process, by making it digital, we'd gone from 15 minutes per object to 4 minutes per object, which when you needed to inventory over 100,000 objects became a very good investment. And in spite of all those logical arguments, actually what really sold this was the photography. And this was a good example of giving people a brief, but also letting them run with it. So the team were asked to come up with photographs of each object, and we had a brief for a fairly basic quality image, but they managed to find a fantastic way of having small portable light tents, portable cameras, portable lighting, which for not that much investment, frankly, in the actual technology, enabled us to capture fabulous images. So we've gone from 5% to 35% of our collection online in over 2 years. We're aiming for over 50% by the time we've finished the project. And that's been seen by 2 million people since January 2021 alone, and over 5 million people since it launched in late 2016. So out of some behind the scenes improvements, we've also managed to create the world's greatest science and technology collection online. So lessons learned, of course, it's not all straightforward. I guess bringing in data management skills that we didn't have before was important. The letting people run with things, as I said, was a real success story. Don't necessarily feel that you need to constrain them and make them stick to the original scope, piloting things on the ground, and inevitably not all the tech worked all the time, but we were able to devise workarounds, and we've got lessons learned next time we start another project of this kind of scale. So finally, just some reflections. I've talked very specifically about one of our projects, but as I said, I think this could apply to anything. Be curious, bring together people with the right skills, give them a clear brief, steer the development, and then use project funding, which is often easier to get than core funding, to drive innovation, gain investment, and use the benefits that you could get in terms of efficiency, accountability, and legacy to justify that. So thank you very much, and I will pass back to Adam.
Jack. If you have any questions for Jack, please put them in the Q&A and we will get around to them after we hear from Lauren. But I feel like I can't really add too much onto Jack's conclusions there, but a few things did jump out at me. The idea of not trying to do everything all at once, I think, goes back to that idea of transformational patience. You have the brief, you know where you're trying to get to, but you're not trying to transform the entire world. You're just starting with what you can change. The importance of having those strategies in place for getting future funding and future projects signed off as well, I think is really key. Agreeing that approach and following through. And I've seen that in a lot of organizations, people kind of thrashing about blindly and not having a clear steer on where they're trying to go and what they're trying to achieve. Getting that agreed in the first place cuts out a lot of the pain of just knowing whether you're doing the right thing, and that's agreed by everyone around you. And at the end there, it's a small point, but that provision of data being incredibly helpful in making decisions. So very often, if you're trying to convince others and get new funding, visualizing what can often be quite a transient thing requires that both the collection of data and that visualization of data, just Jack said before, didn't even exist. But I've seen repeated in many other organizations. But now we're going to hear from Lauren.